Okay, I think we're good to get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of our Virtual Tech Meetup series. It's my great pleasure today to be introducing Kathryn Nanz, who's going to be talking about React accessibility. Before we dive in, just a quick word from our sponsors. So today's meetup is brought to you by LogRocket. Most of you tuning in today will have come from our blog. You may not know that we also actually have a front-end application monitoring solution. It combines error tracking, performance monitoring, infrastructure monitoring, and web analytics all rolled into one. So all of your teams, whether it's your engineering teams or your product teams, can all use a single source of truth for your development. It allows for more efficient remediation of problems and iteration of feature sets, in addition to integration with all of your existing backend monitoring tools. So if you'd like more information, you can just head over to logrocket.com and you can get a personalized demo, or you can just test it for free and just see what it can do for you. Now, with all of that out of the way, I would like to promptly welcome Kathryn to deliver her presentation. Thank you, Kathryn.
Hey there. Thank you so much for that great introduction. Give me just a minute. Let me get my screen shared and all of that. All right. I believe you're able to see it now. Definitely let me know in the chat if that's not the case. But hello, my name is Kathryn Grayson Nanz. I'm a developer advocate at Progress Software. And as someone who has built multiple component libraries from scratch and is now working as the advocate for Kendo React, which is a React component library, it is safe to say that I have spent rather a lot of time thinking about accessibility and optimizing the components that we build so that everybody can use them. It is a topic that I feel very strongly about. And at the end of the day, I really believe that software is for the users. If we are neglecting accessibility features, then we are also neglecting 26% of our users. Yes, according to the Center for Disease Control, 1 in every 4 adults, at least in the United States, has some kind of disability. So to break that down even further, this also from the CDC, states that 13.7% of US adults have a mobility disability. So that might include something like fine motor control, difficulty using a mouse or a touch screen. 10.8% will have a cognition disability, so difficulty remembering things or making decisions. 5.9% are deaf or will have serious difficulty hearing. And 4.6% have a vision disability, which includes things like color blindness and blurred vision, in addition to full blindness. So we're really not talking about some very small niche percentage of your user base here, right? And that 26% figure is going to shift, of course, based on where you're located or the primary target audience of your application. If you have an older user base, it'll probably be a little bit higher. But regardless, it is always going to be a significant portion. And if you're here, it's likely that you already kind of know this and you're already concerned about this, even if maybe you're not sure exactly what steps you need to take to address it in your work. Maybe you've heard the word accessibility being used more and more, but you don't necessarily have a concrete understanding of what accessibility actually entails. So I really want to start with a quick overview to kind of make sure that we're all working from the same page. First, a couple of accessibility terms to know that I'm going to use a lot throughout the rest of this talk, right? The first is WCAG, which can be said either that way or WCAG sometimes, which I don't personally prefer, but you might hear it either way. It's an acronym that stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and these are the defining standards that we use for assessing whether something can be considered accessible or not. These guidelines are regularly updated. Right now, WCAG 2.1 is the most recent. The WCAG 2.2 updated standards we are expecting to arrive early next year, 2023. So you might sometimes hear developers talk about something being WCAG 2.0 compliant or 2.1 compliant or whatever. That's what they're talking about. Obviously, the goal is to be as compliant as possible with the most recent version of the guidelines as quickly as we can after any updates. The other term I want to talk about is assistive technology. That's a blanket term that includes the wide variety of technologies and devices that help users access software and the web. So screen readers and captions are some of the most commonly referenced things. They might be the ones you have the most experience with, but assistive technologies also include things like joysticks, adaptive switches, header eye tracking systems, styluses, braille output devices, so much more. Really anything that helps somebody experience the web more fully can be considered an assistive technology. When we are talking about accessibility, we are talking about the idea that anyone and everyone should be able to access software in the web. And to make that happen, we, the developers, have an obligation to create content that is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. These basic principles are often abbreviated to POUR, and they are the baseline for assessing whether an app or a website is considered accessible. Now, a lot of times when we are thinking about accessibility, we might think about people that have very permanent or obvious disabilities. And while those people are absolutely a crucial part of our user base, they're also not the only ones that will benefit from accessible software. In fact, there are 5 major categories of disability: visual, hearing, motor, speech, and cognitive. Most people are likely to experience at least one of these at some point in their life, even if that is not a permanent situation. This is one of my all-time favorite graphics from Microsoft that does a really good job kind of illustrating this concept, right? Because we can make the mistake of thinking about accessibility features as an edge case or some kind of like nice to have, something we'll add on later that's not really a base requirement. But in reality, accessibility features benefit every single one of your users. So anything that you are building when you're thinking about your hard of hearing users is also going to benefit users who are on public transit without headphones and can't turn up the sound on their device. Or anything you build for visually impaired users is going to benefit users that woke up that morning with like a splitting headache and cannot stand to look at a screen yet. We all need accessibility features, even if we think that we don't. And if you've ever used an operating system in dark mode, or zoomed in your browser to increase the size of the text, or dictated a message to a voice assistant, then you have benefited from an accessibility feature. As developers, it is our responsibility to ensure that we have been thoughtful and intentional about how we are building our software so that it is as inclusive as humanly possible. But it is not only the kind and morally right thing to do, it is also very quickly becoming a legal requirement. In fact, according to the UsableNet research team, in 2020, web app and video accessibility cases went up over 25% year over year in America, and there were more than 3,500 total digital accessibility related lawsuits in that year. In the US, we also have new accessibility legislation in the form of the Websites and Software Applications Accessibility Act that was introduced in the Senate and the House of Representatives in September. So if you're building anything that's going to be used kind of around the world, you can wait and see whether any of your users will choose to take legal action, or you can start focusing on accessibility today and get ahead of it. Accessibility and meeting the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines criteria is just kind of part of having a digital presence now. In the same way that if you had a physical storefront, you would need to meet the Americans with Disabilities Act criteria in the US or Disability Discrimination Act criteria in the UK. So if you weren't already 110% on board with prioritizing accessibility, or maybe you were and you just weren't really sure how to articulate that in order to get that buy-in that you need from a manager or a boss, I hope that this has given you some of the information and the arguments that you need. But now that we've got a solid foundation, let's talk about the React specific stuff that you all came here for, right? A lot of the basics, the stuff that you need to do to make an application accessible, stuff like adding your alt text or checking your color contrast ratios, using labels and forms, that kind of stuff is going to actually be pretty much the same, no matter what framework you're using, right? Alt text is alt text, whether you're writing it in React or Angular or Vue or just HTML. And if you're just starting out or you want to brush up on some of those basics, because I'm not necessarily going to talk about them today, these are some non-React specific resources that I really like. In this talk, I'm going to explain any of these basic concepts that come up in relation to what we're talking about. But if you're looking for a deeper dive, I really recommend checking out some of these. In React, though, things that we need to pay special attention to are the ways in which React modifies the DOM. So practically, we need to be talking about what changes between the JSX that we write and the HTML that shows up in the browser, how and when our components will re-render, and the adjustments that we need to make for single page applications. Oh, and I forgot to mention, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I'm going to circle back at the end of the presentation and take questions then. So if you put a question in the chat, I'm not ignoring you. I just forgot to say that at the beginning of the presentation. But back to React and back to the DOM, right? The DOM matters a lot, and the way that React messes with the DOM matters a lot, because in addition to the DOM tree, we also have what's called the accessibility tree. And that contains the accessibility related information for all of our HTML elements. And that accessibility tree is based on the DOM tree. It uses accessibility APIs to send assistive technologies the information that they need about the name, description, role, state, and interaction options of every single element that is on the page. So for example, let's say we have a dropdown, right? The accessibility tree is what's going to tell a screen reader that the element the user is currently focused on is a dropdown called sizes, and it has 3 options. And those options are small, medium, and large. And the dropdown is currently defaulted to medium, and it's not disabled, so the user can make another selection. All of that information, everything about this dropdown is sent over, right? And we do that for every single element that's on the page. And that is what gives users of assistive technologies the full context and understanding that they need in order to navigate our applications. This is also why it is so crucial for us to use semantic HTML when we are coding. Semantic HTML elements are the ones which are created and named for specific uses, right? So your table, image, button, header, section, aside, your ordered, your unordered lists. The list really does go on and on and on because there are over 100 different named HTML elements. And all of them have that information about the name, description, role, state, and interaction options automatically associated with them. And that sets them apart from the organizational elements, div and span, which don't have any of that information attached. They are really just empty boxes, which is great. We need empty boxes when we're trying to do things like set styles or handle layout organization. But they are completely useless when it comes to communicating information. And by extension, that makes them pretty useless to the accessibility tree and to our user. So suffice to say, if we are getting all of that important information from the DOM, we need to be really aware of how React is altering the DOM so that we can accommodate for those changes and keep the experience as seamless as possible for our users. Let's start by talking a little bit about JSX. JSX, as we know, the syntactic sugar that allows us to write our React components in a way that more closely matches that HTML structure that we were already so used to. But in a way, it's actually kind of too good at its job because it's really, really easy to forget that we are not, in fact, writing real HTML. This is all getting compiled through like React create element functions. You can see kind of this screenshot here is directly from the React docs. So even when we are using specific HTML tags in our JSX, they're still just kind of getting passed as a string to that like React create element function. That's why we capitalize our own components so that React can tell the difference between the stuff that we're creating custom and the built-in components, the like real ones that already exist in HTML, that it can find the corresponding element to kind of like quote unquote translate into. So how can we preserve the semantic content and structure of our elements when we're writing JSX to ensure that by the time this all ends up in the browser, it's still semantic? Now, the first and most obvious thing we can do is to use as many of those actual HTML elements as possible and avoid reinventing the wheel whenever we can. So if we're making a button, we should try as much as we can to use the actual button tag, right? Not jump into creating our own custom button component, and definitely not using something like a div with an on-click action. So even when we need to make our own custom components, as much as we can base them on these actual semantic elements, it's going to really help us out because that will let us leverage all of that accessibility goodness that is kind of built right into them. It's really easy for stuff to kind of get lost. So the more we can take advantage of the elements that have everything built in from the get-go, the easier our job is going to be down the road. One of the places where React developers, myself included, can really struggle with accessibility is when we're thinking about abstracting components. because ideally we really want to make sure that our code is as dry as possible, right? We're trying to create a single component that we can reuse all over the place, multiple ways, multiple different contexts. But when we're working with something that will have multiple roles and multiple descriptions, we also probably need to accommodate multiple HTML tags. This is especially true for layout components, right? Something like a box or a card, or something kind of presentational whose role is going to change depending on how it's being used. So like as an example here, if we have something like a call out box that's being used in the middle of a block of text to like pull out something particularly interesting, that might semantically need to be a block quote. But if we're using that same component to call something out over on the side of the page, maybe that's an aside, And often, we just kind of lazily dodge this whole issue by making this component a div, and we're like, good enough, but it's not really good enough. Thankfully, we have other options here, right? This is a pattern that's used often by several different UI component libraries. It's known as the as prop pattern, and that allows you to pass a semantic tag into a custom component and then render the wrapper as that thing. We've got a little bit of kind of sample code here. I'm also going to show this in a live example in just a moment, but I'm going to talk through it first. So this works by destructuring the props, which then allows us to alias that props.as value as the element and pass it right into the component tag itself. There's also a default props kind of safety net that's been set up here. So we know that that element is always going to be rendered with something in the tag. We're never just going to create an empty tag, right? And when we use this component in our JSX, it will look like this, right? Our element name as whatever we're passing in. And then when we inspect it in the browser, we'll see that that is in fact being used. So let's take a look at that in practice. So I've got a little demo app here. This is my kind of sandbox app that I use for demonstrating all sorts of stuff. It is Star Trek themed because I am a big old nerd. And we can see I've created a very simple call out box component that is using exactly the same code as we have in the slides. So if you want to look at it later, you can reference it. I'm using it right here in a little box that is noting the version of React that I'm using in my app, right? So we can see everything going on here that we just looked at. I'm using it over here in my home app, and I can see, right, call out as P. When we take a look at this and inspect it, right, we can see it's getting the P tag. We swap this out to whatever, right? We can see it change in real time, and it's playing, obviously, the styles that I've got attached to my H1. And over here, we can see it has become an H1. Anything we pass in here, let's see, what else? Do a block quote. I don't think I have any styles associated with that. Yeah, right. Or as a list element, right? And then we get the bullet. We can pass in anything here, and it's going to go ahead and automatically adjust kind of the wrapper, the tag that's being applied to it, which is really, really nice, right? All things considered, this is something very easy that you can add to your components. There's not, right, so there's like an extra line, maybe a couple extra lines if you count the default prop stuff that we're adding to this component. It is not a heavy lift, and yet it really, really makes such a big difference for preserving the semantic structure here. Another challenge that comes with writing reusable components has to do with the accessibility that gets attached to the children of these components, right? So things like icons or labels or alt text for photos, all that kind of variable content that gets really easily overlooked when a component is being reused in different situations and contexts. You always want to make sure that you are including unique and descriptive content for all of those elements, even if it makes the generalization of any given component a little bit harder. So for example, let's say we are making like a product card component, and it's going to have a photo of the product and like a name and a price and a purchase button or something. That product photo is going to be different for every single one of those cards, even if we're generating like a bunch of those cards in a grid, right? All of the actual information in them is going to be different. So we need to make sure that we have added a different prop or added a different way to include the variable alt text that describes each image specifically. And we're not just doing something like repeating product photo as the alt text for all of those cards, because that's not great, right? It's a little bit lazy. Another thing we can do to make our apps as accessible as possible is to leverage fragments in React. Because fragments were not fully supported until React 16.2, which came out in 2017, folks that might have established some of their coding habits in React before that point can kind of forget to make use of them, or especially if you're in like a legacy app, we can see a lot of times where we're not seeing the fragments in use yet. And that's a shame, because fragments are awesome. They're incredibly helpful for preserving that DOM structure that we talked about. Basically, when we want to add multiple elements in a component, we know they have to have some kind of wrapper, right? Something like that at the top, this return without anything around it, it's gonna end in an error. They need to be inside something. And pre-fragments, that was usually a div. And there's some obvious downsides of that, right? You end up with a lot of meaningless and unnecessary divs that clutter up the layout because we needed them at the time in order to make React play nice. But this is especially disruptive to your accessibility work, right? Because assistive technologies make use of what's called landmark elements to understand the structure of a page. So when it kind of skims over the page, it's looking at those high-level elements. And ideally, those should be things like main or nav or section, article, footer, etc. By putting those elements at the highest levels, we allow assistive technologies and their users to understand the structure of the page and what's in it in the same way that we kind of look at a page and visually skim it. But when our high-level structure is cluttered with divs, it's really not helpful. The other thing is that HTML often expects a specific order or structure with some nested elements, and throwing random divs in there can create invalid HTML. So things like tables will expect TRs or TDs as children. Ordered or unordered lists will expect list elements as children. Our browsers have gotten good enough at kind of figuring out what we mean. They're adaptive enough that they will still render something, even if we have like a weird div in there in the middle that's technically breaking the HTML. But this is not necessarily the case, again, for these assistive technologies, where this can really throw a wrench in the works. Thankfully, this has one of the easiest solutions ever, which is fragments, right? Fragments allow us to create empty wrappers. This satisfies the need of the JSX, and then they don't actually render anything in the HTML. So we can write code like this. These are some like empty little fragments here. They're solving the problem, and we are getting the best of both worlds. Now, if you are just starting out with accessibility, it can be extremely helpful to have something that will help check your code and remind you of guidelines that you might have forgotten about while you were working. So for React and JSX, I really recommend the eslint-plugin-jsx-ally. You can see here, that's the link to the GitHub page. It's going to review your JSX for really common accessibility issues and throw errors when you have done things like neglected to write alt text or forgotten captions for your media. It'll check the autocomplete validity of your forms. It will check for associated labels and controls. This is a screenshot of an error that it caught in my code, which I have since fixed. The only thing to keep in mind with this is that it is only checking your static code in the editor. It is not checking the actual rendered like DOM, the stuff that lands in the browser, not there, right? So this is not a replacement for proper accessibility testing in the browser. However, it is still a super helpful tool. It's really good for helping you catch things early. And I think almost more so, it's helpful to kind of help build the habit, build that muscle of coding accessibly, because you get these little reminders all the time. Beyond just the JSX though, there are other things to consider. We also have to keep in mind how a component re-render is going to impact the accessibility of our application. And one of the ways this can be most disruptive is by throwing off the focus, right? Focus is how a browser shows which item is currently highlighted when a user is navigating with their keyboard or another type of assistive technology. You have probably used it before, right? Especially like filling out a form to quickly like tab between different options or like, you know, whatever without needing to grab your mouse. But you can and should try it yourself if you haven't to navigate a whole website, right? So when you load a page, just hit tab, you should see the focus appear if the website is accessible on the first selectable element. And by repeatedly pressing tab, you can cycle through interactive elements on the page without needing to point and click. The focus order is the order in which those elements are highlighted, and that default focus order is determined by, you guessed it, the order of the elements in the DOM. I'm going to assume that we're all at least vaguely familiar with the React component lifecycle, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. I'm just going to point out that the DOM gets updated not only when the application first loads, but then again, every time a component re-renders, which, as we know, is primarily when new props are passed, state is updated, or if we manually force a re-render, right? So React updates DOM and refs. When you are focusing as a user on an element in a component that gets re-rendered, that focus is often either just lost or it gets bumped to some other element. And both of those are really disorienting and frustrating experiences. So as the developer, it is our job to make sure we have a plan in place for refocusing when we know we are going to trigger a component re-render that changes the structure of the DOM. So especially things like confirmation or error text, or like secondary conditional form questions, anything that triggers a pop-up modal, all that kind of stuff. But before we dig into some technical approaches for manually managing the focus, I need to start with a warning that the focus is not something you should touch. Don't mess with it unless you have to. Overriding the natural focus order should only be done basically to fix what we break. We don't want to mess with it. The default order is going to be the most intuitive, so unless we have done something to disrupt it, we don't want to put our hands in it. These approaches that I'm going to talk about should only be used in order to fix what we have thrown off by messing with the DOM. With great power comes great responsibility, and this is a tool to be used cautiously. That being said, when you need to do it, there are a couple ways to do it, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. The simplest way is autofocus. So autofocus will automatically shift the focus to the element that it is applied to, overriding the default focus order. Here's the code sample. We're going to take a look at a live example back here in my little demo app. So, right, so I've got heads up, this is a fake login form. It doesn't do anything. I don't think there's not even a submit button, but that's okay because we're really just talking about focusing on these items, right? And I've got here, let me make sure I've got the right one. Autofocus. There are a couple different ways to do it. I'm going to talk through autofocus first, and then I'm going to talk through the other way, which is using refs in React. So we can see here, where's my, here we go, login autofocus, right? So here's the component that we're calling that's generating basically just these two like username and password things, right? And all autofocus does is just adding this autofocus prop to the element that you would like to be focused on, right? When we refresh the page, the focus should jump over everything else on the page, and we can see that it does here. Jumps right to this password box, even though that's definitely not where it would go otherwise, right? So we can see if we were to remove it and save and refresh. When I hit tab, we're going to start over here in the navigation. And that actually makes a lot more logical sense, right? This is not a real world situation in which I would ever want to override the focus. I want to be clear, I'm only doing it here to demonstrate this approach. Because the situations in which you want to do something like this tend to be more complex and like harder to demo. This is really only useful to us when we're using it mostly in conditionally rendered components, right? So something like a form that triggers a follow-up question if the user selects yes. And then if they say no, there's no second question. In that case, it makes sense. We would want the focus to automatically shift to that new input box as soon as we get that re-render, right? So that it feels very natural to the user. Otherwise, right, this not actually super ideal. But we can see how easy it is to implement, right? So if we had something that was conditionally rendered, we wanted it to jump right to there, autofocus is probably the simplest way possible to do this. Another way to accomplish the same goal with a little bit more of a hands-on approach, it's going to give you a little bit more control, more like granular control, is by using refs and hooking into the lifecycle of your component with useEffect. So in this case, we want to manually set the element that we want to redirect the focus to by creating a ref, adding that to the element, and then calling focus on that ref with useEffect. So in this code sample, I am just recreating exactly what we did in the last example with autofocus, but I'm using this method instead, right? So again, swap back over here and let me change those out. Log in. Refs. Yeah, I know I need to import it. Give me a minute. It's gonna fuss at me. There we go. Okay. Now, refs. So we can see here, right? I've got this super simple fake login component with the 2 input boxes. I've set up my ref here, password input, right, with useRef, and I have added it to the password input box down here in my JSX. And by using the useEffect hook here, we're telling React, do this thing immediately after component render. And in our case, this thing is setting the element that is tagged with that password input ref to be the current focus target. So you can see it's going to work exactly the same way. We refresh the page, we watch the focus jump right down here to the password input. If you prefer classes instead of functional components, you can accomplish the same thing with component-did-mount. This approach is really most useful when, for whatever reason, there's a different action that you want to trigger the focus change that's not necessarily the component re-render or like the page refresh. So for example, something like maybe you close a pop-up modal and you want to move the focus right back to where the user left off, right? Because you pop up a modal, you want to move the focus to the modal, close the modal, you want the focus to go right back to whatever button you use to trigger the modal. So with this approach, right, then you can call that same focus function wherever you need it, and it just gives you a little bit more control than the autofocus approach. Finally, let's talk a little bit about page titles. The page title is the first element that gets announced by a screen reader when a user loads your page. They're also important generally just for giving your user a gist of what's on the page so they know what to expect. This also orients them with the larger structure of your application, helps them tell tabs apart in their browser, helps them set useful bookmarks. Ideally, your page title includes a short description of the page content as well as your application or your brand name. The issue, of course, is that page titles don't automatically update as a user is navigating through a React app because it's a single page application. So we're not actually changing any pages, and therefore we're not triggering those page title updates. From an accessibility standpoint, not ideal. The easiest way to fix this, in my opinion, is to use this library. I've included a GitHub link here. It's called React Helmet, and it helps manage changes to the document head. And it is seriously one of the most dead easy libraries I have ever used in my life. You just add it to your app, import it on the pages where you need it, and then anywhere in the component that you are calling from your router, you can use this line of code, right, helmet, and then you wrap the title and the page title. And we can see, right, so here, here's an example from my demo app. I have just chucked it at the top of any of the components that my router references. So we can see here, right, here's my router, right, calling all these pages. So every single one of these, right, the settings or ops or wherever is going to have this line with helmet right here. I've checked it at the top because I think that makes the most sense, like organizationally, right? Title goes to the top. So just always there, knows what to expect. It is literally, though, just that easy. And we can see, I've got my sidebar toggled off. We can see that that does update in the side now as I move through the app, right? Schedule, data, ops, engineering, whatever. All of that updates as I move through different places in the app. So we're seeing the page title update. And it is genuinely just that easy. And man, isn't it nice to have something that is just that easy? If you are looking for the world's fastest accessibility win, there it is. These are really just a few of the most helpful things I think that you can do to get those really quick accessibility wins in the books when you are first starting out with React. If you are looking to dive a little deeper, and I really hope that you are, then I highly recommend these resources, which are React specific. I have found accessible development to be one of those places where it is easiest to fall into kind of analysis paralysis, right? There's always something that you feel like you need to do a little more research on first, something that you heard someone else is doing, or just a vague feeling like you don't really know enough yet to start tackling accessible coding. And there's just, one more blog, one more conference talk, one more video, and then you'll be ready to start writing accessible code. But meanwhile, our applications, and more importantly, our users, are stuck with that same old inaccessible code that we just keep writing. In my opinion, the best thing we can do is to start writing accessible code to the best of our ability right now, with the acknowledgement that we might make a mistake. Accessibility is not an on-off switch. It's more of like a sliding scale. We can code accessibility features, add accessibility things as we're able, based on what we know right now and the current guidance. And it might not be perfect 100% of the time, but anything is better than just ignoring accessibility entirely. And your code's not carved into stone, right? You can go back and refactor something once you've learned how to do it better. It can be so easy to build up the idea of coding accessibly, like in our heads, into something that is so large and intimidating that we will always find an excuse for putting it off. But in reality, I hope, as I've demonstrated here, accessible code is really just a series of small to moderate adjustments to your development and testing process that are all totally doable by developers of all experience levels, right? Learning new stuff is just part of our jobs. Frameworks, libraries, best practices, languages themselves are going to change and evolve over time. And once you start thinking of accessibility in the same way, kind of make that jump to say, this is not an optional upgrade, this is something that I need to master, you can start building accessible development into your existing processes and patterns at work. So I want to thank you guys so much for joining. And if you have any questions, as I mentioned before, you can go ahead and pop them in the chat. I'm going to take a look at that right now, answer whatever I can. Otherwise, you can find the slides or my demo app at these links, or shoot me an email, send me a tweet, find me online. I'm always happy to chat. Now let me see if I can pull up the chat here. Oh, I don't see anything in the chat. Even better, makes my job easy.
Kathryn, thank you so much for your presentation. And just a reminder to everybody watching that we will be sending a recording of this in addition to all of the links that Kathryn's got here in a follow-up email. I did actually have some questions of my own, if you wouldn't mind indulging me. You were mentioning about quick wins, and I was just kind of curious if you could sort of boil it down. If someone's kind of, if they've got an application that they built without accessibility in mind, and they have to sort of implement accessibility features, what would you say are the biggest quick wins that someone can put into a project?
It's going to sound underwhelming in this React focused one, but probably the easiest ones are not going to be React focused. Alt text is one of the hugest ones that you can do. Semantic Elements is one of the most helpful things. Those are going to get you a huge percentage of the way, actually, because a lot of it, and probably keyboard navigation would be the other one, I would say, is to kind of make sure that you can tab through and access everything from the keyboard. There's nowhere you get like stuck or trapped in a loop or elements that you just can't reach.
So when it comes to React itself, if we're not talking about quick wins necessarily, what would you speak to on that?
Certainly, I would say the fastest one you can do is probably the React helmet thing that will put the page titles at the top of all of your pages, and installing. It's kind of a cheat to say the eslint plugin, because that really is going to tell you everything else that's wrong. And that's going to include things that are React and not React specific. So you'll get kind of the red flags for all of that. And I think that's probably most useful, especially because sometimes it feels like if you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what to look for yet. And to try and track things down can feel really difficult. Having that plugin that will surface issues is going to make it pretty easy. And they've got good links that explain how to fix all of the problems. So that would probably be the fastest.
Yeah, and is there anything that you would think that just comes up time and again that people should really consider thinking about when they're building a project?
Ooh, yeah, with React specifically, I would say it's really just kind of learning how React manipulates the DOM, because the DOM is absolutely connected specifically to the accessibility tree, and so many things that are gonna need need the DOM to leverage, right, to screen readers or other assistive technologies are really reliant on the DOM. And if you don't have an understanding of kind of how React works and how it will mess with the DOM, you're going to kind of struggle to fix what React quote unquote breaks.
Yeah, so
Sorry,
just
you might be able to hear my dog going crazy. Sorry about that.
It's okay. Maybe they can come on as a guest, perhaps. So it's just in terms of just avoiding sort of tech debt, you would say just bearing that in mind from the start, or what would you say to people who have to sort of go back and change things if they've got requests for accessibility?
I would say, yeah, it's a hard position to feel like you have to fix everything at once, right? And it can kind of feel, especially if you're working in like a legacy app, that you've got this like mountain of problems. And to just start building it into any new features that you're doing. Don't use that as an excuse to say, well, it's not accessible anyway, so we're not going to bother yet. You will just dig that hole deeper. But also, it's okay to chip away at this a little bit at a time. And literally anything you do is going to make the app a little bit better and make it a little bit easier for everyone who needs those features. And not everyone's going to use every feature. So if you're able to make something accessible for one person, that's a huge win, but yeah, start with the basics. There was a slide way back at the beginning that actually has a link to a checklist that I really love. Do full screen. This accessibility checklist by the Ally project is so good. And they walk through all of the kind of steps, right? And they break down things that are essential, ideal, specialized, right? And is a good way to kind of say, take a look at your content, and it'll kind of explain which of the WCAG guidelines is this based on, so you can go there and read more about what you need to do, right? But it's just it'll literally let you check them off as you go, to kind of make sure that your bases are covered. Even if you don't get 100% of these checked, any of them that you can check is going to make your app better. So I would say start there, see what you can do in a day or in less than a day, and anything that's bigger, make it into a ticket, plan it into a sprint later, sometime when you can budget the time for it. But a lot of these are faster than you'd think.
Okay, great. We'll be sure to include that link in the post webinar follow-up email as well. I think that's all the questions I have. Just wanted to thank you once again for a great presentation, great deep dive into React accessibility. And thank you again for your time, and for everybody watching. Thank you for joining us. If you would like to see what we have coming in January, we will have a couple more webinars on our Virtual Tech Meetups page. So if you check in on that in the next couple of weeks, we should have some more webinars available to sign up for. In the meantime, thank you, Kathryn.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
And thank you all for watching. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.